The snow came down so thick that Grace Rowland could barely see the ears of her lead horse, and she knew with a bone-deep certainty that she might die out here in this white hell. The supply wagon creaked and groaned beneath her, as the wheels fought through drifts that grew deeper with each passing mile, and the wind screamed across the Montana plains like a living thing determined to sweep her away. It was December of 1884, and she was 3 hours out from Kingston, hauling medical supplies to a mining camp another 10 miles north, because her father had taken ill and there was no one else to make the delivery. She pulled her wool scarf tighter across her face, her fingers already numb despite the thick gloves she wore. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, through the heavy coat and the layers of skirts beneath. Grace was 22 years old and had driven supply wagons since she was tall enough to reach the reins, but she had never driven through weather like this. Her father had warned her not to go, had tried to rise from his sick to stop her, but they needed the money desperately. The mine would pay triple for a delivery in these conditions, and that money would cover his medicine and their rent through the winter. The horses whinnied nervously, their breath coming out in great clouds of steam. She clicked her tongue at them, urged them forward, though she could feel their reluctance in every step. The world had become nothing but white and gray, the sky and ground blending together until she could not tell where one ended and the other began. She should have turned back an hour ago. She knew that now. Pride and desperation had driven her forward when common sense should have driven her home. Something moved in the white curtain to her right. Grace tensed, reaching for the rifle she kept beside her on the seat. Outlaws sometimes used weather like this to their advantage, knowing travelers would be vulnerable and alone. But as the shape resolved itself, she saw it was a single rider on a dark horse, moving parallel to her wagon. The man sat tall in the saddle despite the wind, his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up against the cold. She kept her hand near the rifle but did not draw it. The rider came closer, and she could make out more details now. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a strong jaw set with determination. Ice clung to his mustache and eyebrows, and his horse was covered in a layer of snow that spoke to how long he had been riding. "You should not be out here alone," he called over the wind, his voice deep and carrying despite the storm. "I have no choice," Grace shouted back. "I have supplies to deliver to the Copper Ridge camp." The rider moved his horse closer until he was riding right alongside the wagon. "That is another 10 miles in this weather. You will not make it. I have to try." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes a striking blue-gray that reminded her of the sky before a storm. "Then I will ride with you. My name is Xander Bryant, Grace Rowland. You do not need to do this. I am sure you have somewhere you need to be. Nowhere more important than making sure you do not freeze to death on this road." He said it simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, and something in Grace's chest tightened at the certainty in his voice. She wanted to argue, to tell him she needed no help from a stranger, but the truth was that she was terrified. The cold had already seeped so deep into her bones that she could barely feel her feet, and the wind had grown so strong that it threatened to overturn the wagon with each gust. Having someone else out here, even a man she did not know, made the vast emptiness of the storm feel less suffocating. "I thank you," she said, and meant it. Xander nodded and positioned his horse on the windward side of the wagon, his body and his mount forming a small barrier against the worst of the wind. It helped, though not much. They pushed forward into the white, the horses struggling with every step. The minutes stretched into an hour, then longer. Grace's world narrowed to the simple act of keeping the reins in her frozen hands and urging the horses forward. Xander never left her side, never once suggesting they turn back, though she could see the ice forming on his coat and the way his horse stumbled occasionally in the deep snow. He called out encouragement to her every few minutes, his voice a lifeline in the howling wind. How much farther? He shouted when they had been traveling for what felt like an eternity. Grace tried to calculate, but her mind felt as frozen as her body. 5 miles, maybe 6. There is a way station at Bear Creek about 3 miles ahead. We could shelter there. You know where we are now. She looked around at the featureless white landscape and felt a flutter of panic in her chest. I thought I did, but I cannot see the markers. Everything looks the same. Xander rode ahead a few yards, then came back. The road curves left here. I can feel the slope. Stay straight and we will miss the turn. Grace guided the horses left, trusting his judgment. She had no other choice. The cold was making it hard to think, hard to do anything but focus on the next breath, the next moment. Her father's face flashed in her mind, pale against his pillows, and she pushed the horses harder. She could not fail. The mine needed these supplies, her family needed the money, and she could not let a little snow defeat her, except it was not a little snow. It was a blizzard, the kind that killed people, and she was beginning to understand just how foolish she had been to attempt this journey. There, Xander shouted, pointing ahead. I see the way station. Grace squinted into the white and could just barely make out a darker shape ahead, a building emerging from the storm like a ship from fog. Relief flooded through her, so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. Thank God. They pushed the horses faster, and the way station resolved itself into a small log building with a barn beside it. Xander dismounted before they had fully stopped and came to help Grace down from the wagon seat. Her legs would not hold her when her feet touched the ground, and she would have fallen if he had not caught her. His arms were strong around her, steadying her, and even through all the layers of clothing she could feel the warmth of him. Easy, he said. You have been sitting too long in the cold. Can you walk? I think so. But when she tried to take a step, her legs buckled again. Without a word, Xander swept her up into his arms and carried her toward the way station. Grace wanted to protest, to insist she could walk, but the truth was she could not, and she was too cold and tired to let pride endanger her further. She let herself rest against his chest, felt the solid strength of him, and allowed herself a moment to simply be grateful she was not alone. The way station door was unlocked, as all such stations were, meant to provide shelter to travelers in need. Xander kicked it open and carried Grace inside, setting her down gently on a bench near a cold fireplace. The building was a single room with a few benches, a table and a stack of firewood against one wall. It was not much, but it was shelter, and that was everything. Stay here, Xander said. I will see to the horses and bring in your supplies. The supplies need to stay in the wagon. They are going to the mine. He gave her a long look. Grace, you are not going anywhere else today. That storm is only getting worse. But the mine needs these supplies. There are men hurt, men who need the medicine I am carrying. And they will still need it tomorrow when the storm has passed and we can actually reach them. If we try to push through now, we will die, and then no one gets the supplies. She wanted to argue, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. Xander left before she could try again, and she heard him moving around outside, the sounds muffled by the wind and walls. She looked down at her hands and saw they were white, the fingertips darker than they should be. Frostbite, maybe. She tried to flex her fingers and gasped at the pain that shot through them. Xander came back a few minutes later, his arms full of firewood from outside. The horses are in the barn. They have some hay and are out of the wind. They will be fine until morning. He knelt by the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were licking at the wood, and blessed warmth began to fill the small room. Grace held her hands toward the fire, and the warmth was both wonderful and agonizing as feeling began to return to her frozen fingers. She bit her lip against the pain, and Xander was at her side in an instant. "Let me see," he said, taking her hands gently in his. He had removed his gloves, and his hands were large and warm, calloused from hard work but careful as he examined her fingers. "Not too bad, but you need to warm them slowly. Too fast and you will do more damage." He rubbed her hands between his own, his touch gentle but firm, working warmth back into the frozen digits. Grace watched his face as he worked, saw the concentration there, the genuine concern. He was handsome, she realized, in a rugged sort of way. His features were strong and even, his jaw covered in a few days' worth of dark stubble, and there was a kindness in his eyes that made something in her chest flutter despite the cold and fear. "Why were you out in this storm?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse from breathing cold air, barely above a whisper. "I was heading back to my ranch when the snow started. I should have holed up sooner, but I thought I could make it." He looked up at her, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Seems we both have a stubborn streak. A ranch." "Around here, about 15 miles west. Small operation, just me and a couple of hands. We run cattle, some horses." He went back to rubbing her hands. "I was in Kingston picking up supplies of my own when the weather turned. I know Kingston well. My father and I live there. We run a freight business. Rowland Freight, I know of it. Your father has a good reputation. He is ill. That is why I was making this run alone. We could not afford to turn down the job." Xander's expression softened. "I am sorry to hear that. What ails him?" "Pneumonia. He caught it 3 weeks ago, and he has not been able to shake it. The doctor says he needs rest and medicine, and both cost money we do not have." She looked toward the door, where she could still hear the wind howling. "That is why I cannot turn back. The mine is paying triple for this delivery, and we need that money." "I understand. But you are no good to your father dead. We will get the supplies to the mine tomorrow, when we can see where we are going and when we will not lose our lives trying." She knew he was right, but the helplessness she felt was almost overwhelming. She had been so sure she could do this, so determined to prove she was as capable as any man when it came to running the freight business. Her father had built that business from nothing, had earned respect through years of reliable service, and she could not let it fall apart because he was sick. But Xander was right. Dead, she would be no use to anyone. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying with me. You could have ridden ahead to save yourself." "I could have," he agreed, "but I did not." The simple honesty in those words made her heart skip. She had known this man for only a few hours, and yet he had stayed by her side through a blizzard, had put his own safety at risk to ensure hers. There were not many men who would have done that for a stranger. As warmth slowly returned to her body, Grace became aware of how exhausted she was. Every muscle ached from the tension of driving through the storm, and her head felt heavy on her shoulders. Xander must have seen it because he stood and moved to the far corner of the room, where someone had left a pile of old blankets. He shook them out to make sure no creatures had made homes in them, then brought them over to the bench. "You should rest," he said. "I will keep the fire going and keep watch. You need rest too." "I will rest later. Right now, making sure you recover is more important." Grace wanted to argue, but another wave of exhaustion washed over her, and she found herself lying down on the bench, Xander's coat tucked around her like a blanket. It smelled like horse and leather, and something uniquely him, something that made her feel safe despite everything. She closed her eyes, meaning to rest for just a few minutes, but sleep claimed her almost immediately. When she woke, the light coming through the small window was dim, and it took her a moment to remember where she was. The way station. The storm. Xander. She sat up quickly, looking around, and found him sitting on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall. His eyes were closed, but they opened immediately when she moved. "How long did I sleep?" she asked. "A few hours. It is early evening now." He stood and stretched, and Grace heard his joints pop. "How do you feel?" "Better. Warmer." She looked toward the window. "Is it still snowing?" "Yes, though not as hard. I went out an hour ago to check on the horses and bring in more wood. The drifts are higher than ever, but the wind has died down some." Grace moved to the window and looked out. The world was still white, but Xander was right that the wind had lessened. She could actually see the barn now, a dark shape against the snow. "Do you think we can reach the mine tomorrow?" "If the storm stops overnight, yes. The road will be difficult but passable." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Grace, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really go out in this storm? And please, do not tell me it was just for the money. There is more to it than that." She was quiet for a moment, staring out at the snow. "My father built his business on reliability. He has never missed a delivery, never turned down a job because it was too hard. That reputation is everything in this business. If word gets out that we cannot be trusted, we will lose contracts, lose clients. My father is sick and I am all he has. If I cannot keep the business running, we will lose everything." She turned to look at Xander. "I went out in this storm because I had to prove I could do what he would have done. I had to prove I was strong enough." "You are strong enough," Xander said quietly. "You are out here, are you not? You did not turn back when most people would have. That takes courage, or foolishness. Sometimes the line between the two is thin." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger and more open. "For what it is worth, I think your father would be proud of you, not for risking your life, but for having the strength to keep going even when you are afraid." His words touched something deep inside her, and Grace felt sudden tears prick at her eyes. She turned away quickly, not wanting him to see, but Xander gently caught her arm. "It is all right to be afraid," he said. "It is all right to admit that this is hard. That does not make you weak." The tears came then, spilling down her cheeks despite her best efforts to stop them. All the fear and exhaustion and worry of the past weeks came pouring out, and she found herself turning into Xander's arms, burying her face in his chest as she sobbed. He held her gently, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, murmuring soft words of comfort that she could not quite make out but that soothed her nonetheless. When the storm of tears finally passed, Grace pulled back, embarrassed. "I am sorry. I did not mean to fall apart like that. You have been carrying a heavy burden. Sometimes we all need to let it out." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, and the gesture was so tender that her breath caught. "You are allowed to be human, Grace. You do not have to be strong every moment of every day." She looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw the sincerity in his eyes. This man, this stranger who had ridden out of a blizzard to help her, saw her in a way few people ever had. Not as just the freight driver's daughter, not as the woman trying desperately to prove herself, but as a person with her own fears and needs and vulnerabilities. It was both terrifying and incredibly comforting. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For staying with me, for helping me, for this. You do not need to thank me." His hand was still on her cheek, and she found herself leaning into the touch. "I could not leave you out there alone. I would never forgive myself if something happened to you." There was something in the way he said it, something that made Grace's heart beat faster. She barely knew this man, and yet she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. It was not just gratitude, though she was grateful. It was something deeper, something that frightened and excited her in equal measure. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and Grace thought he might kiss her. Part of her hoped he would. But then Xander stepped back, breaking the connection, and moved to check the fire. "You should eat something," he said, his voice slightly rough. "I have some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags. It is not much, but it will keep you going." Grace nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that curled in her stomach. What had she been thinking? She had known this man for less than a day. These feelings made no sense, were probably just a product of the fear and cold and exhaustion. Once they reached the mine and she could return to Kingston, everything would go back to normal. Xander would return to his ranch. She would continue running her father's business, and this strange, intense connection would fade like a dream upon waking. But as they sat by the fire, eating jerky and talking about their lives, Grace found herself hoping that was not true. Xander told her about his ranch, about how he had saved for years working as a hand on other people's spreads, before finally buying his own land 3 years ago. He talked about his dreams of building something lasting, of raising quality horses that ranchers throughout Montana would want to buy. There was passion in his voice when he spoke, a fire in his eyes, and Grace found herself captivated. In turn, she told him about her life in Kingston, about growing up on freight wagons, about learning to drive a team before she could properly read. She told him about her mother, who had died when Grace was 12, and how her father had raised her alone, teaching her everything he knew about the business. She talked about the challenges of being a woman in a man's world, the way some clients refused to deal with her simply because of her gender, the constant need to prove herself twice as capable just to be considered half as good. "That must be exhausting," Xander said. "It is. But it is also motivating. Every time someone tells me I cannot do something because I am a woman, I make it my mission to prove them wrong. I admire that. Too many people let others define what they can and cannot do. You define yourself." Grace smiled. "My father always said that the only limitations that matter are the ones we place on ourselves. Everything else is just noise." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is. I just wish he would take his own advice and rest instead of trying to work through his illness. Men of his generation, they do not know how to stop. Work is who they are, not just what they do." Xander poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "My own father was the same way, worked himself into an early grave trying to provide for us. I am sorry. It was a long time ago. I was 16 when he passed. My mother followed a year later, from grief I think as much as anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "That is why I understand why you are out here, why you are pushing so hard. You are trying to take care of your father the way he took care of you. It is admirable, even if it is also dangerous." They talked long into the night, the conversation flowing easily despite the short time they had known each other. Grace found herself telling Xander things she had never told anyone, fears and dreams and hopes she had kept locked inside. And he listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel valued and understood. At some point, exhaustion caught up with them both, and they arranged the blankets on the floor near the fire. It was warmer there than on the benches, and they could keep the fire going through the night. Grace lay down on one side of the fire while Xander lay on the other, a careful distance between them that felt both appropriate and somehow too far. "Xander," Grace said into the darkness. "Yes. I am glad you found me today. I do not think I would have made it without you." "You would have found a way. You are stronger than you think." "Maybe, but I am still glad you were there." She heard him shift in the darkness. "So am I, Grace, so am I." Grace closed her eyes and let sleep take her, feeling safer than she had in weeks. She woke to the sound of Xander moving around the room, building up the fire. Pale light filtered through the window, and when Grace sat up, she saw that the snow had stopped. The world outside was buried under several feet of white, but the sky was clear, a pale blue that promised better weather. "Good morning," Xander said, looking over at her. "The storm has passed." Grace stood and moved to the window, hardly daring to believe it, but he was right. The blizzard was over, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow but finally blessedly still. "We can reach the mine today." "We can. Though it will be slow going with all this snow. We should eat something, check on the horses, and get moving as soon as we can. The temperature dropped overnight. It will be bitter cold out there." They prepared quickly, eating the last of Xander's supplies and bundling up in every layer they had. When they stepped outside, the cold hit Grace like a physical blow. Xander had been right. The temperature had dropped dramatically. Her breath crystallized in front of her face, and her lungs burned with each inhale. The horses had fared well in the barn, protected from the worst of the weather. Grace hitched her team back to the supply wagon while Xander saddled his horse, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were back on the road, or what they could find of it beneath the snow. The going was incredibly slow. The wagon wheels broke through the snow crust with each turn, and the horses had to work hard to pull the heavy load. But Xander stayed right beside her, just as he had during the storm, guiding them around the worst of the drifts, finding the safest path forward. His presence was a constant comfort, a steady anchor in the difficult journey. They had been traveling for about 3 hours when they crested a rise and Grace saw smoke in the distance. "The mine," she said, relief flooding through her. "We made it." The Copper Ridge mine was a collection of rough buildings clustered around the entrance to the mine itself, which was cut into the side of a mountain. As they approached, miners came out to meet them, their faces showing surprise and respect when they saw what Grace had driven through to reach them. "We did not think anyone would make it," a grizzled foreman said, helping Grace down from the wagon. "That storm was a killer." "I had help," Grace said, gesturing to Xander. "I would not have made it without him." The foreman shook Xander's hand. "Then we owe you our thanks as well. We have men here who desperately needed what is in that wagon." They unloaded the supplies, and Grace watched as the miners carried the crates of medicine and bandages into one of the buildings. The foreman paid her in cash, counting out the bills with cold, stiffened fingers. It was triple what they normally would have received, and Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This money would cover her father's medicine, their rent, and give them enough cushion to get through the rest of the winter even if her father could not work. "You folks are welcome to stay here and rest before heading back," the foreman offered. "It is a long ride to Kingston, especially in this cold." Grace looked at Xander, a question in her eyes. He shook his head slightly. "We should head back while the weather holds. Another storm could come in, and I would rather not be caught out here again." Grace agreed. They accepted some hot food and coffee from the mine's cook, giving themselves and the horses a chance to rest and warm up, but within an hour they were back on the road, heading south toward Kingston. The return journey was easier without the weight of the supplies, but it was still hard going through the deep snow. Grace and Xander rode side by side when the road permitted, talking to pass the time. Now that the immediate danger had passed, Grace found herself thinking about what would happen when they reached Kingston. Xander would presumably return to his ranch, and she would go back to nursing her father and running the freight business. The thought of not seeing him again left a hollow feeling in her chest that she did not quite know what to do with. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked, and Grace realized she had been quiet for a while. "Just about getting home, seeing my father, making sure he is all right." "He will be proud of you for what you did." "I hope so. Though I suspect he will also be angry that I risked my life." "That is what parents do. They want us to be brave and bold and ambitious, but they also want us to be safe. It is an impossible balance." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and then Xander said, "Grace, may I call on you when we reach Kingston? I would like to see you again if you would allow it." Grace's heart leaped. "I would like that very much." "Good. Because I cannot stop thinking that meeting you in that blizzard was the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time." She looked over at him, saw the sincerity in his face, and smiled. "I feel the same way." They reached Kingston just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the snow. Grace's house was on the edge of town, a small but well-maintained building with a barn and corral out back. Xander helped her unhitch the horses and get them settled, then walked her to the front door. "Thank you," Grace said, "for everything. I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing. I did what anyone should have done. But you are not just anyone." She reached out and took his hand. "You are someone special, Xander Bryant. I knew it the moment you rode out of that storm." He smiled, and she saw affection and warmth in his eyes that made her breath catch. "May I see you tomorrow?" "Yes, come for dinner. I would like you to meet my father." "I would be honored." He squeezed her hand once, then mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering darkness. Grace stood on her porch watching him go, already counting the hours until she would see him again. Inside, she found her father asleep in his bed, his face pale but peaceful. Grace put a hand on his forehead and was relieved to find it cool. The fever had broken. She quietly built up the fire and prepared some broth, and when her father woke a short time later, she told him everything that had happened. He listened without interrupting, though his face showed his worry and concern. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You could have died," he finally said. "I know, but I did not. And we have the money we need now." "Money means nothing if I lose you, Grace. You are all I have in this world. And you are all I have, Papa. That is why I had to do it. We needed that money, and I was not going to let you down." Her father reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but warm. "You have never let me down, not once in your life. You are the bravest, most capable person I know. Your mother would be so proud of you." Tears stung Grace's eyes. "I invited someone to dinner tomorrow, the man who helped me, who stayed with me through the storm. His name is Xander Bryant, and I would like you to meet him." A knowing look came into her father's eyes. "This man is special to you. I barely know him, but yes, he is. Then I will be happy to meet him." The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Grace cleaned the house, cooked her best dishes, and changed her clothes 3 times before finally settling on a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her father insisted on getting out of bed despite her protests, declaring that he was not meeting a potential suitor for his daughter while lying down like an invalid. Xander arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of winter flowers that he must have paid dearly for given the season. He had cleaned up since the previous day, his face freshly shaved and his hair neatly combed, and Grace felt her heart skip at the sight of him. Dinner was wonderful. Xander charmed her father with stories of his ranch, spoke knowledgeably about horses and cattle, and showed genuine respect for the freight business and the work Grace and her father did. Grace watched the 2 men talk and laugh, and felt something settle into place inside her, as if pieces she had not known were missing had finally found their home. After dinner, while her father dozed by the fire, Xander and Grace walked outside into the cold evening air. The sky was clear and full of stars, so many that it took Grace's breath away. "Your father is a good man," Xander said. "He is. And he likes you, I can tell." "I hope so, because I plan to be around for a while if you will have me." Grace turned to face him, her heart pounding. Xander, we have known each other for only 2 days. I know, but sometimes 2 days is enough to know what you want, and I want to know you better, Grace Rowland. I want to court you properly, spend time with you, see where this leads. What if it leads nowhere? What if we find we are not suited after all? Then at least we will have tried. But I do not think that will happen. I think you feel this too, this connection between us. I think you felt it from the moment I rode up beside your wagon in that storm. She had felt it. From the very first moment, she had felt drawn to him in a way she could not explain or deny. I am not an easy person to be with, she warned. I am stubborn and independent, and I do not always do what I am told. Good. I would not want you any other way. He stepped closer, and Grace's breath quickened. I am going to kiss you now, he said softly. If you do not want me to, tell me now. Grace did not tell him to stop. Instead, she rose up on her toes and met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more. Xander's arms came around her, holding her close but not too tight, and Grace let herself sink into the warmth and safety of his embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. I should go, Xander said reluctantly, but I will come back tomorrow if you will allow it. I will allow it. He kissed her once more, quick and soft, then mounted his horse and rode away. Grace stood in the cold, watching him go, and felt happiness bubble up inside her like champagne. Over the following weeks, Xander came to call every day. Sometimes they would sit with her father, talking and laughing. Other times they would walk through Kingston together, and Grace would show him the town she had grown up in. On warmer days, they would drive out into the countryside in her wagon, and Xander would tell her about his dreams for his ranch, the horses he wanted to breed, the life he wanted to build. Grace's father grew stronger each day, the medicine and rest finally allowing his body to heal. By the end of January, he was up and moving around, though Grace insisted he take things slowly. The freight business continued to bring in steady work, and with both Grace and her father working again, they were able to rebuild their savings. But the most important change was in Grace herself. Xander had awakened something in her, a softness and vulnerability she had kept locked away for so long. With him, she did not have to be strong all the time. She could be afraid, be uncertain, be human. And he loved her for all of it, not despite it. It was on a clear February evening, with the stars bright overhead and the snow crunching beneath their feet, that Xander proposed. They had driven out to his ranch so he could show Grace some new horses he had purchased, and they were standing in the corral watching the animals when he suddenly took her hand. Grace Rowland, he said, his voice serious and full of emotion. These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. I wake up every morning thinking of you, and I go to sleep every night dreaming of our future together. I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I will marry you. Xander pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, and Grace felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. This man who had ridden out of a blizzard to save her life had become her whole world, and she could not imagine a future without him in it. They were married in April of 1885, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Kingston. Grace's father walked her down the aisle, his face glowing with pride and health. Xander's ranch hands were there, along with many of the townspeople Grace had known her whole life. It was a small wedding but perfect, filled with love and laughter and hope for the future. After the ceremony, there was a party at Xander's ranch, which would now be Grace's home as well. They danced under the stars, ate food prepared by friends and neighbors, and celebrated the beginning of their new life together. When the guests finally left and they were alone, Xander carried Grace over the threshold of their home, and they spent their wedding night wrapped in each other's arms, whispering words of love and making plans for all the years ahead. Life on the ranch was different from what Grace had known in Kingston, but she adapted quickly. She continued to help her father with the freight business a few days a week, but the rest of her time was spent on the ranch, learning about horses and cattle, helping Xander build the operation they both dreamed of. It was hard work, but it was fulfilling in a way that surprised her. She was building something with the man she loved, creating a legacy they could pass on to their children someday. Her father visited often, his health fully restored. He and Xander became close friends, spending long evenings discussing business and horses and the changing world around them. Grace would watch them together and feel her heart swell with gratitude. She had the two men she loved most in the world, and they loved each other. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The ranch prospered over the next 2 years. Xander's eye for good horses proved sound, and soon ranchers from all over Montana were coming to purchase his stock. Grace handled much of the business side, keeping books and managing contracts, her experience in the freight business serving her well. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other through challenges. In the spring of 1887, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Xander on a warm May evening, the two of them sitting on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the mountains. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him, and Grace felt a flutter of worry. "Xander, are you all right?" He turned to her, and she saw tears streaming down his face. "I am more than all right. I am the happiest man alive. Grace, we are going to have a baby. We are." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt him trembling. "I love you so much," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you. Thank you for this gift, for this life, for everything." Grace held him just as tightly, her own tears falling freely. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." The pregnancy was not easy. Grace was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep anything down. Xander hovered over her constantly, his worry almost comical if it had not been so touching. But she got through it, and by summer she was feeling better, her belly growing round with their child. Her father was overjoyed at the news that he would be a grandfather. He spent hours making toys and carving a cradle, his hands as skilled as ever despite his age. He talked about teaching the child to drive a team of horses, about passing on the knowledge he had spent a lifetime accumulating. Grace knew her father saw this grandchild as a continuation of his legacy, and she was happy to give that to him. In late December, as snow fell softly outside and a fire crackled in the fireplace, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Xander was certain he would lose her. But Grace was strong, stronger than even she had known, and just after dawn on December 23rd, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Xander's father, and he was perfect. He had Xander's dark hair and Grace's eyes, and when he looked up at his parents for the first time, Grace felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. This tiny person was part of her and part of Xander, a physical manifestation of their love, and she vowed in that moment that she would do everything in her power to give him a good life. Xander was besotted with his son from the first moment. He held the baby constantly, talked to him in soft, soothing tones, and refused to let anyone else care for him when he was home. Grace would watch them together and fall in love with her husband all over again, seeing the tenderness and devotion he showed their child. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who loved horses as much as his father did. Grace's father remained healthy and active well into his 60s, playing with his grandson and still occasionally making freight runs, though Grace insisted he take only the easy jobs. The ranch continued to prosper, and Xander and Grace expanded their operation, buying more land and building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. In 1890, Grace gave birth to twin daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth. The girls were identical, with their mother's blonde hair and their father's blue-gray eyes, and they brought chaos and joy to the ranch in equal measure. Xander joked that he was outnumbered now, 4-1, but Grace could see how much he loved being surrounded by his children, how he came alive when he played with them and told them stories. Grace divided her time between the children and the ranch work, and she was happier than she had ever imagined being. This life they had built together was not always easy, but it was good and full of love. She thought sometimes about that day in the blizzard, about how close she had come to dying alone on that frozen road. If Xander had not ridden up beside her wagon, if he had chosen to save himself instead of staying with her, none of this would exist. Thomas and Sarah and Elizabeth would never have been born, and the love she and Xander shared would have remained forever undiscovered. On December 23, 1893, 8 years to the day after Thomas was born, Grace and Xander stood in the snow outside their home, watching their children play. Thomas was 6 now, a miniature version of his father, while the twins were rambunctious 3-year-olds who delighted in mischief. Grace's father sat on the porch, wrapped in a warm blanket, laughing at his grandchildren's antics. "You remember?" Xander asked, slipping his arm around Grace's waist. "The blizzard, I think of it often. I almost did not stop, you know. When I saw your wagon in the storm, I almost rode past. I was cold and tired, and I just wanted to get home." Grace turned to look at him, surprised. "You never told me that." "I am not proud of it, but it is the truth. For a moment I considered saving myself and leaving you to your fate, and then I looked at you, saw the determination in your face even through all that snow, and I knew I could not do it. I knew I had to help you, even if it meant risking my own life. I am glad you stopped. So am I. That decision, that choice to ride beside your wagon instead of past it, gave me everything. It gave me you and our children and this life we have built. If I had ridden on, I would have made it home safely, but I would have spent the rest of my life alone, wondering what might have been." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think we were meant to find each other that day. I think fate put us both on that road at that exact moment so we could build this life together. Maybe so, or maybe we just got very lucky. Can it be both?" Xander smiled and kissed the top of her head. "Yes, I think it can be both. Fate and luck and 2 stubborn people refusing to give up, even when it would have been easier to quit." They stood together in the snow, watching their children play, and Grace felt a deep sense of contentment. Her life had not turned out the way she had expected when she was a young woman driving her father's freight wagons. She had thought she would spend her life in Kingston, taking over the business, living alone, or perhaps making a marriage of convenience. She had never imagined this: a ranch in the Montana wilderness, a husband who loved her with his whole heart, 3 beautiful children, and a future stretching out ahead of them full of possibility. "I love you," she said, the words simple but weighted with everything she felt. "I love you too," Xander replied, "now and always." Thomas called out to them, wanting his parents to come help build a snow fort, and the twins echoed his plea. Grace and Xander looked at each other and laughed, then went to join their children, their hands clasped together, their steps in perfect sync. The years continued to pass, marked by hard work and joy and the inevitable challenges that come with life. Grace's father passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1896, surrounded by his family. He died knowing that his daughter was happy and well cared for, that his grandchildren would carry on his legacy, and that the freight business he had built was in good hands. Grace mourned him deeply, but she found comfort in the knowledge that he had lived to see her happiness, had known the love between her and Xander, and had blessed it. The children grew. Thomas became a skilled horseman and ranch hand, working alongside his father from the time he was old enough to sit a horse. Sarah and Elizabeth developed distinct personalities despite being twins, Sarah bold and adventurous while Elizabeth was more thoughtful and studious. They were close with their brother, the three of them forming a tight unit that filled the ranch house with laughter and the occasional argument. In 1898, Grace gave birth to one more child, another boy they named Henry after her father. He was the baby of the family, doted on by his older siblings and his parents alike. His birth made their family feel complete, and Grace told Xander that she was content now, that this was exactly the family she had always wanted even if she had not known it. The ranch continued to thrive. Xander's reputation as a breeder of quality horses spread throughout Montana and beyond, and they had more business than they could handle. They hired more hands, built more barns, and purchased more land. The small operation Xander had started with became one of the most successful in the territory. But despite their success, Xander and Grace never forgot where they had come from, never lost sight of what mattered most. Family always came first, and they instilled that value in their children. On December 23, 1904, 19 years after Grace had driven her supply wagon into that blizzard, the family gathered in the ranch house for a celebration. Thomas was 17 now, a young man on the verge of adulthood. The twins were 14, beautiful young women who drew the eyes of every boy in the county, much to Xander's consternation. And Henry was 6, full of energy and curiosity. Grace looked around at her family, gathered around the dinner table she and Xander had bought 15 years ago, and felt tears prick at her eyes. "I want to say something," she said, raising her glass. Everyone quieted, looking at her expectantly. Xander reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. 19 years ago today, I was driving a supply wagon through a blizzard certain I was going to die. I was alone and afraid, and I did not know if I would see another sunrise. And then a cowboy rode up beside me and refused to leave my side. That cowboy saved my life, but he gave me so much more than that. He gave me love and partnership and this beautiful family we have built together. She looked at Xander, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I love you with my whole heart, Xander Bryant. Thank you for riding out of that storm and into my life." Xander stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her softly. "Thank you for letting me stay by your side, then and always." The children groaned good-naturedly at their parents' display of affection, but they were smiling too. They had grown up surrounded by love, secure in the knowledge that their parents adored each other and them. It was a gift Grace and Xander gave them every day, a foundation that would serve them well throughout their lives. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Xander watched their children grow and begin lives of their own. Thomas eventually took over much of the ranch work, allowing Xander to slow down a bit as age crept in. He married a local girl, a sweet woman named Clara, and they gave Grace and Xander their first grandchild in 1907. Sarah married a schoolteacher and moved to Helena, where she became active in the women's suffrage movement, making her mother fiercely proud. Elizabeth stayed closer to home, marrying a neighboring rancher and starting a horse breeding operation of her own. And Henry, when he came of age, took over what remained of his grandfather's freight business, modernizing it and adapting to the changing times as automobiles began to replace wagons. Grace and Xander grew old together on their ranch, their hair turning gray, their steps slowing, but their love never dimming. They spent their evenings sitting on the porch they had sat on countless times before, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they would reminisce about that day in the blizzard, about how a chance encounter in a storm had changed the course of both their lives. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met?" Grace asked one evening in the summer of 1920. She was 61 now, and Xander was 64, but she still saw him as the handsome young cowboy who had ridden up beside her wagon all those years ago. "I try not to," Xander admitted, "because I cannot imagine a life without you in it. You are part of me, Grace. You always have been from that very first moment. And you are part of me, the best part." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the day fade into night. Their children were grown with families of their own, but they visited often, bringing grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch still operated, run now by Thomas and his sons, carrying on the legacy Xander and Grace had built. "We had a good life," Grace said softly. "We had a wonderful life," Xander corrected. "And it is not over yet. We still have time, you and I." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him that age had not diminished. "Then let us make the most of every moment." "I intend to." They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, filling the sky with light. Grace thought about that young woman she had been, driving through a blizzard, determined to prove she was strong enough to handle anything. She had been strong, but she had learned that true strength was not about doing everything alone. It was about letting someone ride beside you, about accepting help and giving it in return, about building a life with another person based on trust and respect and love. Xander had ridden up beside her wagon that long-ago day and never left her side. Through storms and sunshine, through joy and sorrow, through the raising of children and the building of a ranch, he had been there. He had been her partner, her love, her best friend, and she had been the same for him. Grace and Xander lived many more years together, surrounded by family and the land they loved. When Grace finally passed away in the winter of 1929, at the age of 68, she died peacefully in her sleep, Xander's hand clasped in hers just as it had been for 44 years of marriage. Xander followed her 6 months later, his heart giving out one quiet summer evening. Their children found him on the porch, a smile on his face, as if he had seen something wonderful just before he passed. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, beneath a simple stone that read, "Grace and Xander Bryant, together in life, together in death, forever in love." Their children and grandchildren tended their graves faithfully, and the stories of how they met in a blizzard, how Xander had ridden beside Grace's wagon and never left her side, became family legend, passed down through the generations. The ranch continued to operate long after they were gone, a testament to what they had built together. And on cold winter days when the snow fell thick and the wind howled, people would sometimes say they could see two figures riding through the storm, side by side, a cowboy and a woman driving a supply wagon, together for eternity just as they had promised. Their love story became a part of Montana history, told and retold, inspiring others to believe that sometimes the most important moments in life come when we least expect them, when we find ourselves in the middle of a storm, and someone chooses to ride beside us rather than pass us by. Grace and Xander's choice to face that blizzard together, to stay by each other's side through every challenge that followed, created a legacy of love that lasted far beyond their years. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the success of the ranch, or the money they had made, or the challenges they had overcome, but the love they had shared, the family they had raised, and the life they had built together. It was a life that began in a blizzard with a simple act of kindness, with a cowboy choosing to help a stranger in need, and it blossomed into something beautiful and lasting, a love story for the ages.